On nights like this, the world feels a little smaller, the roads a little quieter, and the darkness outside the windows almost gentle. The kind of darkness that settles over empty highways and suburban streets long after most people have gone to bed, when the only movement is the slow sweep of passing headlights and the soft vibration of the engine beneath you. There's a strange comfort in those late hours, the hum of the air conditioning, the faint clicking of the turn signal, even the way the dashboard glow paints the inside of the car in muted blues and greens. Most of us have spent at least one night driving through that stillness, watching the road unwind ahead while the rearview mirror reflects nothing but empty space behind. And in that calm, it's easy to believe you're alone, that whatever follows you is just the dark settling back into itself. But sometimes the quiet isn't as empty as it looks. Sometimes, in the subtle flicker of the mirror or the brief shimmer of light behind you, something feels just a little off, a shape that shouldn't be there, a movement that doesn't match your own, or a shadow that lingers a second too long. You might ignore it at first, telling yourself it's the reflection of a street lamp or the blur of your own tired eyes, and most of the time that explanation is enough. Still, there are moments when your stomach tightens without warning, when the silence presses closer, and when you find yourself glancing up again just to make sure. Because the rearview mirror doesn't just show what's behind you, sometimes it shows what's following. And sometimes, if you're unlucky, it shows what you were never meant to see at all. I've driven the same stretch of highway for years, long enough that I know every bend, every patched pothole, every barn light that glows through the fields after sunset. Most nights blur into one another, a quiet routine of finishing my shift, grabbing a coffee for the road, and letting the hum of the engine settle the restlessness that always follows a long day. The drive home is usually the part I look forward to: the empty road, the cool air drifting through a cracked window, the sense that the night belongs to me for a little while. That evening felt no different at first. It was close to 11 p.m., warm enough that the air still held the smell of dry grass and distant asphalt, and the sky had that soft, low-cloud glow that makes the world feel smaller and safer. For the first 10 minutes, I barely looked in the rearview mirror at all. It was only when I merged onto the open highway that something nudged my attention upward. A pair of headlights appeared behind me, far back, small, nothing unusual. I didn't think anything of it. Cars popped in and out of that road all the time, and most nights I didn't see more than 3 or 4 the entire way home. But a minute later, when I glanced up again, the headlights seemed closer. Not dangerously close or tailgating, just closer than I remembered them being. I chalked it up to my mind wandering, maybe mistiming the stretch of road or just feeling tired. Still, something made me keep checking the mirror more frequently, watching those lights hold their distance with an odd kind of steadiness. They never grew brighter, never dimmed, just stayed there, perfectly paced with me. I told myself it was coincidence, but the longer I drove, the more I noticed that the car behind me slowed when I slowed and drifted when I drifted. I tried tiny adjustments just to reassure myself, tapping the brakes lightly, easing the steering wheel an inch left, an inch right, but every motion felt mirrored. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't threatening. It was too controlled, too calm, and that calmness was what unsettled me. It felt deliberate. I remember thinking, why would someone pace a random car this late at night? That question stayed in the back of my mind, growing heavier each time I checked the mirror. Eventually, I realized the shape of the headlights looked older, a little wider apart, set in a squarer frame like cars from the early 2000s. That alone wasn't strange, but it tugged at something in my memory I couldn't place. The road ahead stretched on in long, smooth darkness, but every time I glanced at the mirror, I started paying attention to the outline of the vehicle behind me. I could see just enough to make out a faint reflection along the top edge of its windshield. A reflection that looked like a long, thin crack on the passenger side. That was when a cold, familiar sensation settled low in my stomach. I knew that crack. Or at least I remembered one exactly like it. Years ago, my dad drove an old silver sedan with a windshield crack that looked almost identical. A thin diagonal line caused by a rock hitting the glass during one winter commute. He always meant to replace it but never got around to it, and by the time he passed the car down to me, the crack had become something I barely noticed. After a bad accident, one I walked away from, but the car didn't. The insurance company hauled it away, and I never saw it again. But for years, I assumed it was scrapped for parts or crushed entirely. So seeing a car behind me with the same crack, the same headlight spacing, the same faint, dull glow of aging bulbs, it made my heart beat slow and heavy in a way I can't really explain. It didn't make sense. I knew it was impossible. But the familiarity dug at me. The more I convinced myself it was just coincidence, the more the details piled up in ways I couldn't ignore. The color looked the same in the way headlights reflected off the hood, a soft silver gray that wasn't fully visible, yet too specific to overlook. The silhouette was identical. Even the slight dip of the front bumper reminded me of the old damage it had from a parking lot scrape years back. I kept telling myself I was overthinking it, that reflections can distort things at night, that memory can play tricks when paired with isolation and darkness. But the longer the car stayed behind me, the more it felt like I wasn't misremembering at all. The car wasn't just familiar, it was exact. At one point, I turned off the main highway onto a smaller two-lane road, expecting the car to pass or peel away. It didn't. It slowed and followed, perfectly aligned. I felt the air in the car change, a kind of tightening, like the temperature had dropped by a few degrees without the AC adjusting. My hands felt colder on the steering wheel. The night outside suddenly seemed too still, too quiet. Even the radio, which had been humming softly, felt intrusive, so I clicked it off. The silence that followed emphasized every sound. The tires rolling over uneven patches of asphalt, the faint rattle of something in my glove compartment, the steady thump of my own pulse in my ears. Every minute that the car stayed there added another weight to my chest. Halfway down that back road, I decided to test it again. I slowed almost to a crawl, letting the car behind me catch up if it wanted. But instead, it slowed too, maintaining that same strange, respectful distance. And that was when I noticed something else, something that made the hair rise along my arms. The road behind me was completely dark, no streetlights, no reflective signs, nothing. Yet the car's headlights didn't cast any spill of light ahead of them. In the mirror, I could see the glow, but the ground behind my car stayed unlit, as if the light existed only in the reflection and nowhere else. The realization made my breath catch for a moment. I blinked hard, checked again, lined slightly to adjust my angle. The result didn't change. The light was in the mirror, but not on the road. When I finally gathered enough nerve to pull over onto the gravel shoulder, the car behind me didn't pass. It didn't drive around me or pull up closer. Instead, the headlights in the mirror flickered once very softly like a candle gusted by a breeze, and then they disappeared. 1 second the mirror showed two bright circles. The next second the road behind me was pitch black, stretching, empty and silent. But what made my stomach fully drop was that the glow didn't fade, it vanished. Like someone had turned off a switch. There was no movement, no approach, no retreat, just nothing where something had been moments before. I sat there for nearly a minute, waiting for the car to reappear or for the sound of tires crunching behind me. But the night stayed dead quiet. Eventually, I forced myself to look away from the mirror and turn my head to check the back window directly. The darkness outside was complete, the kind where distance disappears. When I looked back at the mirror again, I expected more emptiness. Instead, the faintest shimmer of light glowed not behind me but inside the car. It was subtle, almost like the reflection of a phone screen, except my phone was off and the passenger seat beside me was empty. As the light hovered behind my headrest for just a moment, the shape of it stretching like headlights bending through fog. And somewhere under that glow, barely visible, was the suggestion of a figure. Not solid, not clear, just the impression of someone sitting in the back seat, leaning forward slightly. I didn't dare turn around. I couldn't. My throat felt tight, my hands stiff on the steering wheel, yet I didn't move. The mirror felt like the only safe place to look, even though every instinct begged me not to. After a long, breathless moment, the glow thinned and dissolved into the darkness. The mirror reflected only my own pale face again, wide-eyed and tense. I don't remember restarting the car, but I remember driving the rest of the way home without checking the mirror once, keeping my eyes locked on the road ahead as if whatever had appeared behind me could only exist if I acknowledged it. For weeks after, I avoided driving at night. When I finally did, I angled the rearview mirror away so it reflected the ceiling instead of the road behind me. Even now, years later, I still can't bring myself to look at it directly in the dark. Because sometimes, when the night is quiet and the road is empty, the mirror catches a faint glow in the back seat, two small lights hovering where a face should be. And each time, without needing to look twice, I already know what car they belong to. Driving at night was something I used to enjoy in a quiet, private way, especially during the colder months when the city lights seemed softer and the air inside the car felt warm and contained. I worked part-time as a rideshare driver back then, mostly on weekends, picking up people coming home from dinners, late shifts, or quiet evenings with friends. Winter nights had their own rhythm, long red lights that reflected on wet asphalt, the steady hum of the heater, and that faint rattle from the sunglasses compartment I could never get rid of. Most nights felt peaceful, predictable. I'd start my shift around 8 and ease into the night, watching the city thin out until it was just me, the road, and whatever music I played low enough to barely hear. There was comfort in knowing I wasn't really alone out there, just in the quiet hours that belonged to people like me. It was one of those nights when the air carried the sharp smell of frost, and the windows fogged easily unless I cracked them open just a bit. I remember how still the streets were when I accepted my last ride request of the evening, something near a row of old apartment buildings on the edge of downtown. The pin dropped behind a brick building with a narrow alley. I pulled up slowly, headlights brushing against dumpsters and a fire escape. The place was empty enough that I kept my eyes on the mirror, expecting someone to emerge from the shadows at any moment. But nobody came. No footsteps, no figure approaching with a hand raised in apology for making me wait. The timer on the app counted down, blinking softly, and after 5 minutes I canceled the trip and marked it as a no-show. Nothing unusual, it happened more often than people thought. I eased back into the main road, planning to head home when I noticed the tiny shape of breath inside the car, a thin patch of fog drifting near the rear door window. At first I assumed it was just leftover condensation from when the heater shifted settings, but as I glanced in the rearview mirror, the fog moved again, rising slightly the way someone's exhale might when they lean forward. I told myself not to overreact. It was winter. Temperature changes made the glass behave strangely. Still, something in me tightened without my permission. The air felt heavier, as though the warmth inside the car had been disturbed by something quiet and uninvited. I turned the heater down just a little, listening for any sound from the back seat, a rustle, a shifting coat, anything, but the only thing I heard was the low rumble of the engine. I kept driving, trying to steady my breathing, but I found myself checking the mirror more often than usual. The back seat looked empty, of course, smooth leather, nothing out of place. But every so often I caught a glimpse of something dark near the edge of the frame, a shape too low to be a person, too still to be a shadow cast by a passing car. The first few times I blinked and looked again, it vanished. After the fourth or fifth time, it stayed for a second longer, just long enough to convince me it wasn't my imagination. Someone might say exhaustion can do strange things late at night, but fatigue doesn't make the air feel like someone is sitting close behind you. Fatigue doesn't make the small hairs on your arms lift when there's no draft. A few blocks later, I stopped at a red light, and in the stillness that followed, I heard the softest sound, a gentle shifting noise like fabric brushing against fabric. It came from behind me. I froze, eyes locked on the mirror. The back seat remained empty, but the dark shape I'd been catching glimpses of now had a faint outline, almost like the curved top of someone's head too low to be seen directly. The light turned green, but I didn't move right away. For the first time that night, I felt genuinely unsure of what was happening. But I forced myself forward because sitting still felt worse somehow, like whatever I wasn't seeing might decide to move if I didn't. I kept telling myself I needed sleep, that my mind was filling in blanks the way it does when you stare into the dark for too long. But the irregularity grew sharper, harder to reason with. At the next stop sign, the interior lights from a passing store window spilled across the back seat, and for a split second I saw the faint impression of someone sitting there. A small form, as if leaning slightly toward the center, head angled down. The moment the light shifted, it vanished again. I didn't dare turn around. Something told me the mirror was the only safe way to see it, and even then only barely. As I drove, the car felt heavier, like the weight distribution had changed. Even the suspension reacted differently when I went over dips in the road, a softer bounce in the back, a subtle shift that didn't match an empty seat. Each time I inhaled, I swore I could smell something new in the air, something faint and cold, almost metallic, like old winter air trapped inside a coat. I gripped the steering wheel a little tighter, trying to convince myself that nothing was happening. Yet every mile seemed to echo the truth I didn't want to face. When my phone suddenly buzzed with a new ride request, the sound made me jump. I hesitated before looking at it, afraid of the small confirmation I already felt twisting in my stomach. The name on the screen was one I hadn't heard or seen in almost a year, a passenger I had driven months earlier, on a night that ended in an accident I still tried not to think about. They had been sitting in the back seat when we were hit, and though I survived with some bruises and a long ache in my ribs, they didn't make it. I remember their voice, their laugh, the exact place they were sitting. And now their name was glowing on my screen like they were requesting a ride again. My throat went tight. My hands trembled on the wheel. I hadn't even known the app could glitch like that. Slowly, almost unwillingly, I raised my eyes to the mirror again. The shape in the back seat was clearer now. Not fully defined, not detailed, but undeniably there, someone leaning forward, as if waiting for me to accept the ride. As if they'd been there the entire time, silent and patient. A faint fog of breath drifted upward and faded. I didn't say anything. I just stared until my vision blurred with fear. Something deep inside me insisted that I keep driving, keep my eyes on the road, keep breathing as long as it would let me. I didn't accept the request. I dismissed it, hand shaking so much I nearly dropped the phone. For a moment, nothing changed. The shape didn't move, the car didn't react. But then slowly the outline began to fade, dissolving like mist in the corner of the mirror. The heaviness in the car lifted with it, the suspension leveling out as though an unseen weight had stepped away. By the time I reached my street, the air inside the car felt lighter again, though I didn't feel relieved, just numb and hollow. When I parked, I couldn't bring myself to look in the mirror one more time. I got out of the car quickly, locking it behind me even though that felt pointless. I told myself it was over, that fear can mimic things, that apps glitch, that mirrors warp reflections. But later that night, when I opened the rideshare dashboard out of morbid curiosity, there it was. A completed trip listed at the exact time I had dismissed the request. No pickup address, no drop-off location. Just a timestamp and the name of the passenger I hadn't picked up, or the passenger I couldn't have picked up. I don't drive at night anymore, and on the rare occasions I sit in the back seat of someone else's car, I catch myself watching the rearview mirror without meaning to, half expecting to see a small shadow leaning forward. Sometimes, when the windows fog just right, I swear I catch the faint imprint of breath behind me, quiet, cold, and patient, like someone still waiting for the ride they never finished. I used to take a particular backroad home from my friend's place whenever I stayed too late. It wasn't the fastest route, but it was the quietest, a long stretch of cracked asphalt that cut through farmland and thick clusters of trees. At night, the branches arched overhead, forming a dark tunnel that felt disconnected from the rest of the world. I always rolled the windows down a little, just enough to let in the cool night air and the soft hum of crickets. The atmosphere had a certain stillness that helped me unwind, the kind of quiet that made you feel like you were the only person awake for miles. I never minded the darkness there. It felt predictable, almost comforting in the way familiar roads can become part of your routine. The night everything changed started off no different than any other. It was close to midnight, and a thin layer of fog clung low across the fields, drifting across the pavement in slow, lazy curls. My headlights cut through it just enough to show the faded yellow lines and the glint of wet leaves blown into the corners. I had a thermos of lukewarm coffee sitting in the cup holder, and every so often I took a sip, letting the bitterness keep me alert. The car's interior lights were dim, casting soft reflections on the windshield, and the radio played low enough that I could barely hear the melody. I wasn't thinking about anything in particular, just driving, letting the road guide me through the quiet. About 10 minutes into the drive, I glanced in the side mirror, and that was when I noticed it. A person walking along the right side of the road, just at the edge of the pavement. At first, I assumed they were a jogger or someone heading home late, though it struck me as strange considering how isolated that stretch of road was. They were walking at a steady pace, head down, arms swinging slightly. Nothing alarming, nothing unusual. I drove on, assuming I would pass them by in a few seconds. But when I looked in the mirror again, they were still perfectly aligned with my car, neither falling behind nor getting ahead, just keeping pace with me. I frowned, telling myself the mirror might be distorting distance in the dark. But as I kept driving, matching the same speed I always took on that road, the figure remained right beside the car, their silhouette cutting a sharp shape against the fog. Something about the way they moved bothered me. Their stride was smooth, too smooth for walking on uneven ground. There was no bounce in their step, no shift in weight from one leg to the other. It looked more like they were gliding, their bodies swaying with the rhythm of movement, but without any real motion behind the steps. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, suddenly aware of how alone I was out there. A minute later, I slowed slightly to take a familiar bend in the road, and the person slowed too, keeping perfect alignment with the passenger door. My chest tightened in a way I didn't expect. I watched them through the mirror again and tried to catch a clearer glimpse, but the fog blurred their features. Even when the headlights caught the faintest reflection, their face didn't illuminate. It was as if the fog swallowed every detail except the basic human outline. I told myself it was a trick of the distance, that maybe they were farther away than they seemed, but the steady packing felt too intentional to ignore. When I sped up just a little, the figure sped up too, not with a burst of effort or a longer stride, but in the same unnatural, gliding manner. As though they weighed nothing, as though the ground beneath them didn't matter. I felt a cold prickle crawl slowly up my spine. My hand drifted toward the window controls without thinking, and I rolled the passenger window up fully, even though it had been open only an inch. The sound of the night air cut off abruptly, replaced with the muted rush of the heater and the dull thrum of the tires against the road. But even with the window closed, I couldn't shake the sense that something outside the car had shifted closer. I tried to keep my eyes forward, focusing on the twin beams of my headlights cutting through the fog. But every few seconds, I found myself checking the mirror again, unable to resist the pull of whatever was packing me. The figure was still there, always exactly beside the rear passenger door, never ahead, never behind. Their silhouette flickered faintly like it was being lit from behind by a distant, shifting light source, though the road behind us was completely dark. I felt my breathing grow shallow, the kind of quiet panic that doesn't explode but expands slowly, tightening everything inside you. Around the halfway point of the road, the fog thickened and visibility dropped sharply. I eased my foot off the accelerator, letting the car drift at a cautious speed. The world outside the windshield turned hazy as though the night had been reduced to shapes and shadows. And still through the mirror the figure walked. Their head moved slightly for the first time, tilting upward just enough that I sensed their face was angled toward the car. Even without detail, the shift felt intentional, like they wanted me to notice. As the fog thinned a little, I approached a small bridge that crossed over a shallow creek. The bridge had metal railings on both sides and no shoulder, meaning if the figure truly was walking beside me, they would have to fall behind or step onto the narrow strip of leaves that bordered the rail. My pulse quickened. It was irrational, but some part of me needed confirmation, needed to know whether they were really there or if my mind had been constructing something out of shadows. I slowed further as I reached the bridge, and for the first time since noticing them, I turned my head just enough to glance through the side window instead of the mirror. Oh, there was nothing there. No person, no shadow, just the empty stretch of railing gliding past in the dim glow of the headlights. I exhaled shakily, relief and confusion washing through me at the same time. When I looked forward again, a small laugh escaped my throat, the kind of weak laugh people make when they've scared themselves for no reason. I told myself I was exhausted, that the fog and the dark road had played tricks on my peripheral vision. I almost convinced myself. Until I checked the mirror again. The figure was now standing directly behind the car. Not walking, not packing, standing, perfectly centered in the red wash of my taillights, motionless except for a slight tilt of the head. The fog swirled around them, giving the impression that they were both present and not fully formed. My breath caught in my chest so abruptly that I felt a sharp ache beneath my ribs. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel and forced my eyes back to the road, refusing to look at the mirror again. I drove the rest of the way home with a sickening awareness that the figure might still be following the car, step for step, hidden just beyond where my headlights could reach. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I didn't park right away. I sat there with the engine running, staring ahead at the faint outline of my garage door. The yard was silent. The air felt unnaturally still, as though the whole neighborhood was holding its breath. Only after several minutes passed without any sound behind me did I finally shut off the engine. I didn't check the mirror before getting out. I didn't look behind me as I unlocked the front door. I couldn't bring myself to. For weeks afterward, I avoided that back road entirely. Even now, I rarely drive alone at night. On the occasions when I have no choice, I keep the side mirrors angled down toward the wheels and the rearview mirror tilted upward so it reflects nothing but the ceiling of the car. Some people laugh when I tell them mirrors make me uneasy, but I don't offer explanations. I don't tell them how sometimes, just sometimes, I swear I catch a faint silhouette packing beside me in the reflections of storefront windows as I drive past. Always at the same pace. Always just out of sight. Always remembering me, even when I try not to remember it. I've never been someone who cares much about cars. To me, a vehicle is just something that gets me from one place to another, and as long as it starts when I turn the key, I don't complain. A couple of years ago, when my old sedan finally gave out, I bought a used car from a small lot on the edge of town. It wasn't anything special, a faded blue hatchback with a few scratches on the doors and an interior that smelled faintly of worn leather and pine air freshener. The salesman told me it had character, which usually means the previous owner didn't take great care of it. But it drove smoothly and nothing rattled too much, so I took it home without thinking twice. I didn't examine the details the way some people do. I didn't test every feature. I certainly didn't pay attention to the rearview mirror, even though it was scratched along the bottom edge, the kind of scratch that looks like someone dragged a key across the glass. For the first week, everything felt normal. I worked late shifts at a small supply warehouse, and the half-hour drive home became part of my routine. The nights were cold then, the kind where the air feels thin and the road looks darker than usual. Most of the time, the only sounds in the car were the engine humming softly and my jacket brushing against the seat whenever I adjusted my posture. The rearview mirror sat there like it always had in every car I'd driven. Not something I actively paid attention to, just a necessary shape above the dashboard. I never expected it to show me anything I wouldn't see if I turned around. The first time I noticed something odd, it was so small I almost ignored it. I was driving home on a two-lane stretch where the road dips down into a shallow valley. The hills block out the sky for a moment, and the only light comes from your own headlights reflecting off the road. As I started down the slope, I glanced up at the mirror and saw that the back seat looked darker than usual. Not pitch black, but shadowed in a way that didn't match the lighting inside the car. I turned around briefly and saw the seat normally, faintly lit by the dashboard glow. When I looked back at the mirror, the darkness was still there, like a faint smudge over the reflection. I wiped the glass with my thumb at the next stoplight, thinking maybe it was dust or leftover residue from someone's stickers, but the smudge didn't move. A few days later, I began noticing something else. Whenever I checked the mirror while backing out of my driveway or switching lanes, the reflection of the street behind me felt slightly off, as if it lagged a fraction of a second behind the actual movement of the car. It wasn't dramatic or supernatural, just a subtle delay that made me blink and look twice. Sometimes the headlights of a passing car would appear in the mirror a beat later than they should have, or a parked mailbox would shift slightly in the reflection as though being repositioned. I told myself it was just the old glass warping light in a strange way. Older mirrors can do that, or at least that's what I repeated to myself every night. But the irregularities grew harder to ignore. One evening, I was driving through a residential area, taking a shortcut I used often. The houses on that street all had similar mailbox posts and trimmed hedges, and most families kept their porch lights on. As I rolled through at a slow speed, I glanced at the rearview mirror and frowned. The house behind me looked different in the reflection, darker, with no porch light, and the front door appeared to be a different color than the one I had just passed. When I turned my head to check, the house behind me was normal. The reflection was. I stared at the mirror for a long moment. Nothing changed. But something inside me shifted like a small, heavy stone settling at the bottom of a lake. I rubbed my eyes, convinced I was tired and imagining things, and tried to steady myself with a deep breath. But as I drove on, the mirror seemed to show small inconsistencies, a street sign facing a different direction, a tree missing its leaves even though the one behind me was full and green. The more I tried to ignore it, the more the differences grew. It wasn't showing me a different place entirely, just a subtly altered version of the one I was leaving behind. A week into this, I experienced the moment that fully chilled me, not in a dramatic, shocking way, but in a quiet, breath-holding way that made me feel hollow. I was heading home late, close to midnight on a quiet stretch of rural road. The sky was clear and the moon was bright enough to illuminate the fields. The headlights reflected gently off the gravel when I slowed for a curve. When I checked the mirror, I saw a person standing in the center of the road behind me. I froze for a second, staring at the figure. Their posture was straight, their arms at their sides, but their features were impossible to make out. They stood at a distance that should have been visible if I turned around. So I did, slowly, cautiously, but the road behind me was empty. Empty in the way wide open spaces are empty, where there's not even room for doubt. When I looked back at the mirror, the figure was gone. I should have pulled over or driven away quickly. Instead, I sat there with my breath caught in my chest, hands gripping the wheel, feeling the night press in around the car. The silence outside was absolute. Even the engine sounded distant, muted by the tension in my ears. When I finally drove on, I didn't check the mirror for almost the entire ride home. But of course, eventually I looked again. Over the next few nights, the mirror became something I dreaded. Sometimes it showed the road behind me exactly as it was, calm and empty. Other times I caught glimpses of movement, a quick shift of a shadow, the faint outline of someone standing just outside the beam of the tail lights, a car parked where there was none. Each sighting lasted no more than a second, but it was enough to keep the unease growing inside me like a slow, creeping vine. The worst moment came on a night when the roads were slick with rain. The mirror had been quiet for days, and part of me wanted to believe the strange phase had passed. I drove carefully, the windshield wipers beating a steady rhythm, the scent of damp pavement drifting through the cracked window. At one point, I caught my reflection in the mirror, or what I thought was my reflection. The angle was slightly off, but the face was undeniably mine. Same features, same expression, except the eyes weren't following the road. They were looking directly at me. I jerked my head upward, staring at the mirror. My reflection stared back normally, eyes forward. But the image I had seen a heartbeat earlier was burned into my mind, the tired version of me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not anger, not sadness, something closer to a warning, something I didn't understand. After that, I couldn't drive without feeling like the mirror was showing me pieces of something waiting to be assembled, something I wasn't sure I wanted to understand. The small distortions, the figure on the road, the alternate reflections, all of it felt like glimpses into a place that overlapped mine but didn't belong to me. A place where something else lingered. So eventually, I removed the rearview mirror entirely. It left a small, ugly mark on the windshield where the mount had been glued, but I didn't care. Driving felt quieter without it, and the car seemed less occupied. Still, sometimes I catch my reflection in other surfaces, shop windows at night, the microwave door in my kitchen, even the dark screen of my phone. And every so often, just for a second, I see that older, tired version of myself staring back from a different angle than the one I'm standing at. And whenever that happens, I can't shake the feeling that removing the mirror didn't fix the problem. It only made it harder to see where the reflections are coming from now. I've always liked driving at night, especially in winter. There's something strangely peaceful about empty roads blanketed in white, the whole world softened under snow. When I used to work late shifts, I'd often be the only car heading out of town at 2 or 3 in the morning. Everyone else was tucked away in warm houses, lights off, curtains drawn, while my headlights carved pale tunnels through the drifting flakes. It made the world feel smaller, quieter, almost safe. I never imagined that same stillness could turn into something suffocating, or that a night drive home could become one of the memories I still struggle to talk about. I remember that night vividly. The storm had moved in faster than the forecast predicted. By the time I left work, thick snow was already falling sideways, pushed by wind sharp enough to sting exposed skin. My car heater worked overtime, humming loudly, filling the cabin with dry warmth that fogged the windows if I didn't crack one open. The snow on the road muffled everything: sound, light, even the feeling of movement. Driving felt like floating through a white, shifting void. Every few minutes I brushed my wipers up a notch, but they still struggled to clear the windshield before fresh flakes smothered it again. The radio signal kept flickering, fading to soft static, but I didn't mind. The storm had a way of making silence feel natural. About 15 minutes into the drive, after passing the last cluster of houses, I glanced into the rearview mirror out of habit. At first, all I saw was whiteness, the faint glow of my own brake lights reflecting off the swirling snow. But then, as the storm thinned for a moment, I noticed something darker behind me, a shape moving steadily along the road. My first thought was that maybe another driver was walking for help, someone whose car had broken down. But as the image clarified, I realized it was a man, alone, on foot, walking in the middle of a blizzard. I eased my foot off the gas, not fully braking but slowing enough to get a better look. The man was far back, maybe 30 or 40 yards, dressed in something dark that stood out sharply against the snow. His gait was steady, almost unnaturally smooth for someone trudging through drifts that deep. I watched him for several seconds, expecting him to falter, slip, or raise a hand to shield his face from the wind. He didn't. He walked with a strange, unwavering rhythm, not fighting the storm but moving through it effortlessly, as though it didn't touch him at all. I remember whispering, "How is he even out here?" The roads were empty, the visibility terrible. No sane person would choose to walk through that kind of weather. My first instinct was to pull over, let him catch up, and offer a ride. But something held me back, a feeling I couldn't quite explain. Maybe it was the way he moved. Maybe it was the way the wind seemed to bend around him. Or maybe it was the way my stomach tightened when I realized I couldn't see his face. A gust of snow obscured the mirror again, and when it cleared a few seconds later, he was closer. Much closer. I hadn't slowed enough for him to make that kind of distance. My heart gave a dull, heavy thump. I turned forward again, gripping the wheel tighter, telling myself the mirror might be distorting the distance through the storm. But the unease lingered, twisting low in my chest. I accelerated a little, not enough to draw attention if anyone saw me, but enough to put space between us. When I checked the mirror again, my breath hitched. He was still there, exactly the same distance behind me. Walking, effortlessly, keeping perfect pace despite the car now moving faster. The storm only seemed to make it stranger. My headlights lit the road ahead in a narrow cone, but behind me the taillights glowed against the snow like twin red orbs, and in their halo the man moved steadily forward, never slowing, never quickening his step. The wind whipped snow in waves across the asphalt, but none of it seemed to stick to him. His outline stayed sharp. clear, too clear. For the next mile or so, I kept trying to convince myself I was imagining it, that the storm was playing tricks with depth perception, that maybe it was a shadow or a tree line or anything else. But each time the snowfall thinned enough for me to see him, he was still there, walking in perfect rhythm with the car. I whispered to myself, please stop looking, just drive. But every few seconds I checked anyway, unable to help it. Humans weren't meant to see someone moving like that in a storm that could freeze exposed skin in minutes. People slip, shiver, bend their shoulders, brace their weight. He did none of that. At one point, the wind died down for a few seconds and the mirror cleared completely. That was when I finally noticed something that made the hairs on my arms rise all at once. His feet, or what should have been his feet, weren't sinking into the snow. They moved across the surface like he was gliding, barely disturbing the drifts. I stared until my eyes burned, waiting to see even one puff of powder rise around his steps. Nothing. I don't remember deciding to speed up, but I did. The engine growled softly as I pressed the gas, pushing the car a bit faster than felt safe on a road half buried in snow. My tires skidded once, catching traction again with a jolt that sent adrenaline surging through me. I didn't care, I needed distance. Space, anything. For a minute or two, I kept my eyes forward, refusing to look at the mirror. But a creeping feeling climbed up my spine, slow and cold, like someone running icy fingers from the base of my neck to my shoulders. Against every instinct, I glanced up again. He was closer. No matter how fast or slow I went, no matter how winding the road became, the man never changed his pace and never changed his distance. And then, without warning, my car hit a patch of black ice. The steering wheel jerked in my hands and the back of the car slid sideways. I gasped, trying to correct the skid, but the tires scraped helplessly across the slick surface. For a moment, the world spun in a dizzying blur of white and red. When the car straightened a second later, my heartbeat thundering in my ears, I looked instinctively into the mirror. And he was standing directly behind the car. Not walking anymore. Not even a few feet back. He stood inches from my bumper, perfectly still, perfectly centered, his face indistinct but undeniably turned toward me. No snow fell on him. No wind tugged at his clothes. He simply stood there as if he had arrived the moment the car lost control. My chest tightened so sharply it felt like I'd forgotten how to breathe. I didn't move. I didn't blink. I don't even remember thinking for those first few seconds. I only stared, frozen in place, watching the shape of him remain motionless in the swirling storm. Then a gust of wind slammed against the car, and the snow thickened again, swallowing him whole. He was gone. Just like that. I didn't wait. I didn't check the mirror again. I drove the remaining 7 miles home with both hands gripping the wheel, breathing shallowly, refusing to slow down even when the wipers struggled to keep up. I didn't look behind me once. Not when I parked. Not when I closed the door. Not even when I locked every window in my house. But the strangest part came later. On clear nights, when there's not a hint of snow on the ground, I sometimes see footprints in my backyard. Long, evenly spaced, perfectly straight footprints, like someone walking at a steady pace from one end of the yard to the other. They never start or end anywhere. They just appear, crossing behind the house in a perfect line. And every single time when I see them, I feel the same cold sensation climb up my spine. The same feeling I had the night the man stood behind my car. The storm may have passed, but whatever I saw in that mirror, it still knows how to find me. I spent a winter weekend at a remote cabin a couple of years ago, the kind of place people book when they want to disconnect from everything. It sat at the base of a pine-covered slope, just far enough from town that the only sounds at night were the groan of old branches and the low hiss of wind curling around the roof. The owner kept an old Jeep parked beside the cabin for guests to use if they needed to drive into the nearest town for groceries, and I remember feeling a strange fondness for how outdated it looked. Its interior smelled like cracked vinyl and faded air freshener, and the engine had a heavy rumble that made the whole vehicle vibrate gently when idling. The mirror was scratched and slightly fogged along the edges, but I didn't think anything of it. I liked old things that still worked. The first day passed quietly slow snowfall, a walk by the frozen creek, the kind of simple solitude you don't appreciate until you've spent months surrounded by noise. When evening settled in, I took the Jeep into town to grab a few things I'd forgotten. The sky was a deep matte blue, the kind that blends into the snowbanks until you can't quite tell where the horizon ends. The drive was peaceful, and I remember thinking that the Jeep handled surprisingly well on the icy road. But on the way back, with darkness thickening around me, something in the mirror caught my attention. It was nothing dramatic, just a small, rounded shape in the back seat, low enough that I initially mistook it for a bag or a bundled coat. When I turned my head for a better look, the seat was empty. I brushed it off as a trick of the lights. Old mirrors distort reflections all the time, especially when temperatures swing as quickly as they had that day. Still, I caught myself checking it again a few minutes later. This time the shape was gone entirely, as if the reflection had corrected itself. I remember exhaling softly, not out of fear but mild embarrassment that I had let a shadow unsettle me. The heater rattled, the glass fogged a little, and the road dipped under the tires in a familiar way, as everything returned to normal. But the next morning, on my way to pick up more firewood, the shape appeared again. It was more defined this time, still small, still rounded, but positioned in the exact center of the back seat in the reflection. My foot hovered over the brake for a moment, though I didn't actually stop. I remember the way my breath hitched, forming a thin streak of condensation on the inside of the windshield. Again, I turned around. Again, the back seat was empty. And again, the mirror showed something that didn't belong. Throughout the day, the cabin's silence felt different. Not threatening, just heavier, like it was holding onto something instead of letting it echo freely the way wide, empty spaces usually do. Even small sounds, the shift of snow sliding off the roof, the pop of wood expanding in the heat, felt sharper than they had the day before. By evening, I tried to convince myself I was being silly. Maybe the mirror's old silver backing was deteriorating, creating ghost shapes. Maybe the cold was messing with the glass. I clung to those explanations even though somewhere deep in my chest, unease began to settle like cold air sinking into still water. That night I drove into town again and the shape appeared almost immediately. The Jeep's interior was dim, lit only by the dashboard glow, but the mirror showed that rounded silhouette sitting quietly behind me, as though someone too small to be seen directly was watching the road with me. Every bump made the shape shift slightly in the reflection, as if reacting to the movement. I felt a subtle tightening under my sternum, quiet, steady fear that I didn't want to acknowledge. I told myself not to look, to focus on the road, but the mirror kept pulling at the corner of my vision. About halfway to town, I heard it, a soft, almost inaudible tapping from behind me. It wasn't rhythmic, not like something rattling loose. It sounded deliberate, the gentle touch of fingers against vinyl. I froze, hands gripping the wheel tighter. The heater hummed louder, but the tapping continued, faint and patient. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. Instead, I used the mirror, my eyes moving slowly upward as if I expected to catch something mid-motion. The shape remained exactly where it had been, small and still, but the tapping seemed to sync with the gentle sway of my breath, like something behind me was leaning forward a little, adjusting its position with each exhale. My mouth felt dry. My pulse thudded in a slow, heavy rhythm that didn't match the tapping or the engine. When I blinked, the mirror fogged slightly from my own breath, and for a moment the shape behind me seemed clearer, almost childlike in size, the top of the head just barely cresting above the seatback. I drove the rest of the way in silence, not daring to lower the radio's volume or adjust the heater. Every small shift inside the Jeep felt amplified, like the air was dense enough to hold sound differently. When I parked under the streetlight near the grocery store, the shape vanished again. The tapping stopped. The back seat reflected normally. And yet, stepping out of the Jeep felt like stepping out of a room where someone had been sitting quietly, breathing softly, waiting for me to return. The real turning point came the next evening. Snow had fallen harder during the day, leaving only a narrow strip of road cleared from the cabin to the junction. I reversed the Jeep carefully, tires crunching over the packed snow. The mirror was coated in a thin layer of frost that melted slowly as the cabin's warmth spread. When the frost cleared enough for me to see, I froze completely. Well, the child was not in the back seat. Well, the child was standing behind the Jeep. Not fully visible, not crystal clear, but there, reflected in the mirror. A small figure wearing something nondescript, maybe a coat or maybe just shadowed clothing, standing still with their head angled slightly downward. I turned around quickly, heart pounding in my throat. The road behind me was empty. So when I looked back at the mirror, the figure was still there. I didn't breathe for several seconds. The air in the Jeep felt wrong, thick, and unmoving, as if I had shut myself inside a sealed room with something I couldn't see. Slowly, instinctively, I shifted the gear from reverse to drive. The reflection flickered for a moment, the figure's outline blurring as though it were made of smoke. Then it dissolved completely. My hands trembled against the wheel as I pulled forward, refusing to look back again. I left the cabin early the next morning. I said nothing to the owner when I handed back the keys. I avoided giving any explanation because deep down I knew there wasn't one that made sense. Not one that wouldn't sound like the product of sleepless nights and overactive imagination. But every so often, when I'm in a parking lot or sitting at a long stoplight, I catch myself checking the rearview mirror with a sudden, involuntary flick of my eyes. And sometimes, just for a second, I see that same small shape reflected behind me. Silent, patient, barely visible. Well, the child never moves. The child never makes a sound. As it only appears when I'm alone and the night is too quiet. And every time it does, a part of me wonders if it ever truly stayed behind at that cabin. Or if it found something else to follow instead. I've always liked driving along the coast at night. Something about the way the air cools the closer you get to the water, or the way the road feels different when the ocean runs beside you, soft and heavy like a low breath in the dark. Back then, when I was working late shifts at a delivery warehouse, I'd often take the long route home just for the quiet. The coastline was usually empty after midnight, and the only sounds were the low hum of my engine and the steady crash of waves somewhere beyond the guardrail. Most nights I felt like I was passing through a world that was half asleep, as if the darkness itself was too tired to bother me. That habit made me feel safe for a long time until the night everything changed. The air was colder than usual, sharp enough that I kept the heater on a low, constant hum. The rear window tended to fog at the corners when the temperature dropped, but I didn't mind. I remember rolling my shoulders to loosen the tension from work, leaning back into the seat and letting the warm air wash over my hands. The road stretched ahead in a thin, wavering strip of light. Behind me, the mirror reflected nothing but distant darkness. I felt calm, at ease, completely alone. Somewhere along that stretch, maybe 20 minutes into the drive, I noticed a faint smudge on the inside of the back window. It looked like a streak, almost like someone's fingertips had brushed the glass lightly. At first, I thought I had accidentally touched it when loading boxes earlier. But as I kept glancing up, something about the placement bothered me. The streak was higher than where my hand could have naturally reached from the driver's seat. And the more I looked, the more it resembled not random fingerprints, but long, thin marks sliding downward, as if made by someone pressing their hand against the glass from the inside. I tried to ignore it, telling myself the cold could make moisture do strange things, but a minute later I saw something that made my breath catch. Another streak formed right there before my eyes, slowly dragging itself across the fogged surface. The movement was so faint I almost missed it. My heart thudded once, heavy and slow. The heater hummed on, the ocean roared distantly. The streak continued its arc as if an invisible finger traced it with deliberate pressure. I remember turning down the music without realizing my hand had moved. My pulse started to climb, steady and uneasy. I forced myself to look away from the mirror, focusing instead on the curve of the road. But even with my eyes forward, I could feel something change in the air inside the car. The warmth felt heavier, like it wasn't circulating right. I could hear my own breathing too clearly, almost as if the car had become a sealed space, holding every sound in place. When I finally glanced up again, the streaks had multiplied. Not by many, just 2 or 3 more, but enough that the back window looked touched, explored, disturbed. I pressed my lips together, telling myself I was imagining things. I must have touched the glass earlier. Or maybe the rubber lining was leaking cold air and making condensation patterns. I repeated those explanations quietly like a mantra, but none of them explained why the newest streaks were fresh. Still moving, still forming. The next part is the moment I knew something was wrong, truly wrong. I slowed, approaching a sharp bend where the coastal cliff jutted close to the road. My headlights illuminated the rocks ahead in a long sweep. For a moment, as the car tilted with the curve, the mirror caught the faintest glimpse of the back window. And in that brief reflection, I saw the outline of a face. It wasn't clear or detailed. It was a pale, fogged impression, something pressing forward from the inside, flattening what could have been a forehead or cheek against the glass. The features were blurred, but the shape was unmistakable. A human face, too close, too present, far too real. My hands tightened so hard around the wheel that my knuckles ached. I didn't pull over. I didn't stop. I kept driving because some ancient instinct deep in my chest told me not to let the car become still, not to give whatever I had seen the chance to become clearer. For several minutes, I refused to look in the mirror again. I stared ahead, forcing myself to breathe evenly, pretending that nothing had changed. But even then, I could feel the weight of something behind me, a presence, a pressure. Every time I inhaled, I felt like the air I pulled in wasn't mine alone. It was the feeling of being watched by someone sitting too close, someone leaning forward, someone patient. When I finally gathered the nerve to look, I did it in one quick, shaky glance upward. The mirror showed only darkness behind me, the faint shimmer of passing waves and the soft glow of my taillights reflecting on the guardrail. The window looked clear again. No streaks, no face, nothing unusual. Except the glass wasn't fogged anymore. At all. As if something had wiped it clean. I swallowed, gripping the steering wheel so tightly it shook slightly in my hands. The heater was still on, still blowing warm air into the cabin, but the back window looked too clean, too bare. It looked freshly cleared, like someone had run their sleeve across it with deliberate care. I told myself I must have imagined it all: stress, exhaustion, reflections playing tricks with the fog. Anything to explain away the crawling chill in my spine. So I kept driving, trying to loosen my shoulders, telling myself not to look back again. But the unease didn't leave. It held onto me all the way home, hovering behind me like an invisible passenger. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I stopped the engine and sat there for a long moment, listening to the ticking of the cooling engine and the faint hiss of the heater winding down. The night outside was calm, normal, safe. I told myself I would check the back window in the morning, that I'd laugh about it once I saw nothing there. That sleep would reset my nerves. But I didn't sleep. It's every time I closed my eyes, I saw the blurred shape pressing against the glass, the way it seemed to lean forward, hungry for warmth. And when morning came, I walked out to the car with shaky determination, telling myself it was finally time to put the whole thing to rest. But the back window wasn't clean. It was covered in faint marks, hundreds of them, not streaks, not fingerprints. Handprints, small ones, oppressed from the inside. I sold the car that same week. Still, even now, whenever I'm near a window fogged from heat or breath, I catch myself staring a little too long, waiting to see if something presses forward from the other side. Something small, something patient, something that remembers the warmth of my car. And every so often, a faint shape forms before fading again. A quiet reminder that whatever pressed its face against that glass wasn't done watching me. There's something about night driving that invites a different kind of memory. Maybe it's the way the world shrinks to the small circle of light ahead of us, or how the glass around us turns into a stage for things we'd rather not see. These stories remind us that the quiet places behind us, the ones we rarely think about, can hold shadows we don't fully understand. And sometimes, the things reflected back aren't warnings or threats, but echoes of moments we were never meant to witness. The road teaches us its own kind of truth. That fear doesn't always come from what's in front of us. Sometimes it lingers in the places we avoid looking. If you've ever felt that subtle pull toward the mirror on a long, empty drive, you're not alone. We all have those moments when something in the reflection seems a little too still, a little too familiar, a little too willing to follow. Maybe it's exhaustion or memory or simply the mind trying to fill the dark. Or maybe the dark has always held a little more than we think. Either way, it's a shared feeling, that small tightening in the chest, that quiet question we don't say out loud. It's comforting in its own strange way, knowing someone else has felt it too. As we end the night here, let your breathing settle back into the room around you. The stories stay where they belong, safely behind the glass, fading as the light returns. If these whispered roads and dim reflections kept you company for a while, you're welcome to return again whenever the night feels too long or too silent. And if you want more stories told in this same quiet way, you can stay connected, subscribe, share, or simply remember to come back the next time sleep feels far away. But for now, rest easy and let the mirrors stay dark until morning. Some things only follow us when the world is quiet and the night has listened enough for one evening.